Have you ever felt like someone, or something, was watching you out there in the woods? Not a person, not an animal, but something older, something that knows you're there? That's exactly the feeling that haunted Ethan Rowe, a 28-year-old rookie forest ranger, on an October morning in 1986. Back then, Ethan was the kind of guy who still believed nature had rules, that everything could be explained if you just looked close enough. But that year, deep in the damp heart of southern Washington, he discovered a rule the forest never wrote down. The day began in a dull gray haze. Fog hung between the evergreens like smoke that refused to fade. Ethan's government-issued Ford pickup rattled along a dirt service road that hadn't seen a grader in months. Mud splashed across the windshield. The radio sputtered static. He was headed to check on an old hunting cabin after a call about animal damage. Routine, he told himself, except nothing out here ever really was. When he arrived, the first thing he noticed was the silence. No birds, no distant woodpecker, not even the soft chatter of squirrels. Just quiet, heavy, unnatural. The cabin door was torn open, the hinges twisted like soft metal. Claw marks, or what looked like claw marks, raked across the wooden frame. Inside, furniture lay smashed, the walls splintered, the iron stove bent inward as if something massive had slammed into it. Ethan crouched to examine the floor. That's when his flashlight caught something that made his breath freeze. A footprint, 17 inches long, wide as a man's forearm, pressed deep into the damp earth. The stride between them measured 6 feet. He did a quick calculation in his head. Whatever made those prints must have weighed at least 600 to 800 pounds. He whispered, "That's no bear." The air shifted. A branch snapped outside. Ethan spun toward the door, his pulse hammering. The forest was still, except for a faint movement at the edge of the clearing. At first, Ethan thought his eyes were playing tricks. The fog moved, shapes shifting. Then, behind a massive fir tree, something shifted back. 2 faint amber reflections blinked in the mist. Eyes. And then the rest of it came into view, not all at once, but in slow, deliberate motion. A broad, upright silhouette, easily 8 feet tall, shoulders as wide as a doorway, fur the color of dark coffee slicked with rain. It stood there, motionless, watching him. Ethan's brain scrambled for logic. Bear? Escaped primate? Hallucination? But nothing fit. The proportions were wrong. The posture, wrong. The intelligence behind those eyes, unmistakable. He didn't run. Couldn't. Every muscle locked in place. For several long seconds, they simply stared at each other, man and myth, measuring intent in silence. Then, the creature took a slow breath. A deep, resonant sound rolled through the trees. Not a growl, but something closer to a word. Guttural. Purposeful. And just as quietly as it had appeared, it turned and melted into the forest. Gone. Ethan stood frozen for nearly a minute before collapsing onto the porch steps, trembling. His rational mind screamed that it couldn't be real, but his instincts whispered otherwise. You saw it. You know you did. That night, Ethan sat alone in the ranger station, surrounded by the sterile hum of fluorescent lights. The clock ticked like a metronome. His report form lay blank in front of him. Cabin damage. Cause unknown. He hesitated. Wrote another line. Possible bear activity. Then stopped. He thought about those prints. The eyes. The sound. A voice interrupted his thoughts. Late night, rookie. It was Frank Dwyer, his supervisor, a weathered man with a salt and pepper beard and the kind of calm you only earn from surviving decades in the wild. He set a steaming mug of coffee on Ethan's desk and pulled up a chair. Ethan tried to sound casual. Cabin's a mess. Some kind of big animal. Didn't look like a bear, though. Frank raised an eyebrow. No? What did it look like then? Ethan hesitated. I don't know. Big. Walked on 2 legs. The tracks were. Frank's hand came up, palm out. Stop right there. Ethan blinked. The older ranger leaned forward, voice dropping to a near whisper. Listen, kid. You'll hear stories around here. Things that don't make sense, that don't fit in any manual. You want advice? When you see something like that, you write bear damage and move on. Ethan frowned. You've seen it too, haven't you? Frank didn't answer, just stared into his coffee, his silence louder than words. After a long moment, he stood, placed a hand on Ethan's shoulder, and said quietly, "Some things in these woods don't belong on paper. You understand?" Then, as he walked away, "You'll sleep better that way." Ethan stared after him, the room suddenly colder. Days passed, but the forest felt different now, alive in a way it hadn't before. Every patrol felt like walking through someone else's home, one who knew every twig, every gust of wind, every step he took. He tried to forget, but the image of those eyes followed him into sleep. A week later, he returned to the cabin site. He told himself it was for closure, but deep down, he just needed to know if it was real. The forest was silent again. Too silent. He found the same deep tracks near the tree line, fresher this time. The same massive stride. The same precision. But something new waited for him. Beside one of the prints, half buried in moss, lay a single object. His ranger glove, the one he'd lost during the first inspection. Clean. Untorn. Placed there deliberately. Ethan turned it over in his hand, his heart pounding. There were no scratch marks, no teeth impressions. It hadn't been stolen. It had been returned. The realization hit like thunder. Whatever that thing was, it wasn't just watching him. It was thinking. By late October, the nights grew longer and the forest colder. But Ethan couldn't let it go. He packed his gear, told the station he was running an overnight wildlife observation, and hiked a mile beyond the cabin to set up camp. When the sun disappeared, the forest transformed. The canopy swallowed the moonlight, and the sounds of life, crickets, frogs, owls, faded one by one. Sometime past midnight, the first sound came. Not a snap, not a rustle, footsteps. Heavy ones, slow and deliberate, crunching leaves just beyond the tent line. Ethan froze, hand instinctively gripping his flashlight. He didn't turn it on. He didn't want to scare it. The sound drew closer, then stopped. He held his breath. The air vibrated with a low, rumbling tone, almost like humming, but deeper, resonating in his chest. He whispered, barely audible, "It's okay. I'm not here to hurt you." The rumble ceased. The forest went silent. Then, after what felt like an eternity, the sound receded, footsteps fading back into the darkness. He stayed awake until dawn, eyes fixed on the tent's thin fabric, pulse slowly easing. Fear was still there, but something else had joined it. Respect. When morning came, Ethan packed his gear. But before leaving, he did something he couldn't fully explain. He placed an apple on a flat rock near his campsite. A gesture, an offering, maybe. He didn't know if the creature would understand, but somehow he felt it would. He returned to the ranger station that afternoon. Frank gave him a knowing look, but didn't ask questions. Ethan filed his report, kept it simple, and went home. 3 days later, he hiked back to the same spot. The apple was gone. In its place lay a smooth river stone, pale gray, perfectly centered on the rock. Ethan picked it up, thumb running along its surface. It was clean, dry, and heavy, placed there deliberately. He smiled to himself. It wasn't proof. It wasn't data. But it was communication. And in that quiet moment, standing beneath a sky of whispering fir trees, Ethan Rowe realized he wasn't alone in these woods. Something out there, something intelligent, something ancient, had chosen not to harm him, maybe even to trust him. And as he walked away, he couldn't help but feel that this was only the beginning. Do you believe trust can exist between two beings who don't share a single word, who don't even belong to the same world? For Ethan Rowe, that question would define the next year of his life. It started with a single apple on a rock and became the most extraordinary connection any human could imagine. The first snow of the season dusted the forest floor like powdered sugar, muffling every sound. Ethan's boots crunched softly as he made his way back toward the clearing near the cabin. He carried the same pack he always did, field rations, a map, a small notepad, but this time, something else, a cloth bag filled with apples, granola bars, and smoked salmon from his own kitchen. He reached the flat rock, the one where he'd left that first apple weeks ago. It was bare now. Ethan hesitated, then knelt down and placed a single red apple in the center. He waited, listening. The forest breathed. A distant jay called. Wind whispered through the firs. Nothing else. He sighed, stood, and turned to leave. Then, a low sound drifted through the trees, deep and rhythmic, almost like a hum. Not close, but not far. He froze. "It's you, isn't it?" he whispered. No response. Still, the hum continued. Not threatening, not panicked, just aware. He left the apple, backed away slowly, and returned to camp. The next morning, when he came back, the apple was gone. In its place was a small branch of huckleberries, still fresh and glistening with dew. A trade. Ethan smiled, the first genuine smile he'd worn in months. Over the next few weeks, a pattern emerged. 3 times a week, always at dawn or dusk, Ethan would leave offerings. Apples, salmon, granola, once even a small silver harmonica. And every time, something appeared in return: stones stacked in pyramids, feathers arranged in spirals, once even a collection of bird nests woven together into a rough ring. It wasn't random. It was deliberate. He started calling the creature Greypaw, inspired by the dull silver hue he'd glimpsed along its forearms in the fading light that first night. He never saw Greypaw directly again that winter, but the signs never stopped. Footprints, carefully placed objects, a presence that hovered just out of sight. Sometimes he'd hear the deep, resonant hum from the trees, the same tone as before. Ethan began responding in kind. A soft whistle, a gentle tap on the tree trunk, the kind of sounds he used with wary animals. It wasn't language, but somehow, it was communication. He kept all of it secret from Frank Dwyer, the supervisor who'd warned him to forget. Ethan wrote coded notes in his field journal, routine observation, local fauna adapting to seasonal scarcity. But beneath that, scribbled in faint pencil, he added one word: contact. It was late January when Ethan's quiet exchange turned into something far greater. Snow lay deep over the trails. He hiked to his usual spot, leaving apples and smoked fish on the stump. The air was brittle with cold, the forest wrapped in stillness. He turned to go, and froze. 50 feet away, between 2 snow-covered cedars, Greypaw stood. This time, there was no mist or darkness to hide in. The creature's full height was staggering. Easily 8.5 feet, chest broad and fur thick and matted with frost. Its eyes were deep amber, intelligent, calm. For a heartbeat, neither moved. Then, slowly, Greypaw lifted one massive hand and placed it flat against the trunk of a nearby tree. Palm open, fingers spread. Then, with deliberate motion, it touched that same hand to its chest. Tree. Then self. Ethan's breath fogged in the cold. He hesitated, then mirrored the motion, palm against a nearby tree, then to his own chest. For a long second, the two of them just stood there, man and giant, breath forming twin clouds in the frigid air. Then Greypaw gave a low, soft sound, a rumble that resonated deep in Ethan's chest, like a purr too large for any throat. And then, without a sound, it turned and walked back into the woods. Ethan stood rooted to the ground long after it vanished, heart pounding. He didn't fully understand the gesture, but he knew what it meant. Home, self, respect. That night, he wrote in his journal. He wanted me to know, this forest isn't just mine to protect. It's his home too. In the following weeks, Ethan lived 2 lives. By day, he patrolled the forest like any ranger, logging wildlife sightings, checking permits, clearing trails. Frank Dwyer noticed the long hours but said nothing, though once, over coffee, he muttered, "You're spending a lot of time up near the old cabin lately." Ethan shrugged. "Plenty of elk tracks up that way." Frank gave a slow nod. "Elk, huh? Right." The silence between them said more than words ever could. But by night, Ethan returned to his hidden trail. The offerings continued, each one exchanged with an object that carried some strange meaning. A smooth river rock balanced on a stick, a feather wedged into a knot of bark, even once a bird skull placed beside a quartz crystal. It wasn't random. It was symbolic. He started sketching them in his notebook, rows of drawings and short notes, possible language of placement. Objects chosen intentionally. Intelligence confirmed. And yet, he told no one. Because who would believe a ranger saying he'd befriended something most people mocked as a campfire myth? March arrived, bringing thaw and rain. Ethan's small camp was set beside a creek swollen with meltwater. He sat by the fire, frying trout in a tin pan, when a sudden silence fell. Every frog, every bird, gone. The forest hushed. He turned slowly. There, at the edge of the clearing. Great ball. Closer this time. 20 feet away. Ethan didn't move, didn't speak. He just lowered his gaze, showing no threat. Graypaw sniffed the air, then rumbled softly. It stepped forward, one heavy footfall at a time. Now only 10 feet separated them. Ethan could see the texture of its fur, the scars beneath it, the way breath steamed from its nostrils. Its eyes weren't savage. They were curious. The creature crouched, extending one long arm. It didn't reach for him. Instead, it pointed, first at the fire, then at the sky, then at Ethan. He didn't understand, but he mimicked the gestures. Fire, sky, self. Graypaw tilted its head. Then it made the same gesture as before, hand to tree, then to chest. Home. And Ethan, voice trembling, whispered, yours too. For a long moment, they just looked at each other, two beings sharing a language older than words. Then Graypaw stood, gave a soft, rumbling breath, and vanished back into the woods. Ethan sat motionless, staring into the dying fire. The rain began again, but he didn't move. Something sacred had just happened. Something fragile. Spring came to Gifford Pinchot with a burst of green. Ferns unfurled. The rivers swelled. The forest came alive again. Ethan's secret friendship deepened. He kept a careful rhythm. Every few days, he'd leave food. Graypaw would answer with signs. Sometimes, footprints appeared beside his tent, as if the creature had stood watching him sleep. Once, Ethan found a large, perfectly intact bird nest placed beside his backpack. Inside it, a single smooth rock. He whispered into the trees, "Thank you." There was no reply, but he swore he felt the forest listen. Frank Dwyer started asking questions. "You've been quieter lately," he said one afternoon. "Everything good out there?" Ethan nodded. "Yeah, just busy. Spring runoff's heavy." Frank watched him carefully, then said something that made Ethan pause. "Sometimes the forest gives you gifts, Ro. Just remember, some gifts come with responsibility." Ethan didn't ask how he knew, but he had the feeling Frank wasn't just talking about weather or wildlife. It was early summer when something remarkable happened, something that proved beyond doubt that Graypaw wasn't alone. Ethan camped by the creek again, the sound of rushing water masking his small fire. Sometime after midnight, a rhythmic sound echoed through the valley. Thump, thump, pause, thump, thump. He froze. It wasn't thunder. It wasn't footsteps. It was deliberate, like someone striking hollow logs. He turned off his flashlight and listened. The rhythm repeated. Then another set answered from deeper in the forest. Thump, thump, pause, thump. A conversation in sound. Ethan felt goosebumps rise along his arms. Slowly, he joined in. He picked up a stick and tapped it softly on a fallen log near his fire, mimicking the pattern. The forest went silent. Then, faintly, a reply came. Thump, thump, thump. He couldn't help but smile. They were acknowledging him. For nearly an hour, the pattern continued, a back-and-forth exchange between worlds. When it finally stopped, the forest returned to its normal rhythm, but Ethan knew everything had changed. He wasn't just observing anymore. He was included. A week later, Ethan left one final note in his field journal. Graypaw initiated gesture again. Mutual acknowledgement. Agreement unspoken but clear. No harm, no intrusion. Respect each other's world. That night, before leaving the forest, he stood by the old apple rock one last time and placed a small gift, a silver compass engraved with the words "Find your way." He didn't know if Graypaw would understand, but it felt right. As he turned to leave, a low hum rolled through the trees. Deep, warm, familiar. Ethan smiled. Goodbye, my friend. He never wrote those words in any official report. But deep down, he knew this wasn't the end, only the beginning of something far larger. What if the myths we laugh at are just the stories of neighbors we've never met? After his first encounter, Ethan Rowe thought he'd reached the limit of understanding. He thought Gray Paw was alone, a single anomaly in a vast, indifferent wilderness. He was wrong. That fall, heavy storms rolled through Gifford Pinchot. Trails washed out, landslides closed roads, and the forest seemed to retreat inward. For months, there were no signs, no footprints, no offerings, no low hum in the night. Ethan searched, but the silence was absolute. Then one morning in late October, while patrolling near the northern ridge, he found something strange. A cluster of trees stripped of bark in perfect vertical lines, each scar exactly shoulder height to Gray Paw. It wasn't random. It was marking. Ethan examined the cuts. Some were older, others fresh. They formed a path leading toward a canyon he'd never explored. He hesitated. This wasn't part of his assigned patrol zone. But something deeper, instinct, maybe loyalty, pulled him forward. He followed the trail for nearly an hour before reaching a clearing rimmed by towering cedars. At its center lay a massive fallen log, and beside it, a print, larger than his hand, deeper than any he'd seen. But what caught his breath wasn't the size. It was that there were two smaller ones beside it. Children. Gray Paw wasn't alone. Over the next few weeks, Ethan returned quietly, careful not to intrude. He noticed patterns, fresh fish bones left by the creek, matted grass where large bodies had rested, and once, faint laughter. Not human laughter, but a high-pitched, breathy trill that rose and fell like wind chimes in the trees. He began sketching what he saw. His journal filled with notes, at least 3 individuals. One adult male, Gray Paw, one adult female, smaller prints, lighter gait, one juvenile. He felt a strange responsibility now, not to study, not to expose, but to protect. He knew the outside world wouldn't see what he did. They'd see monsters, trophies, headlines. So he told no one. In August, lightning ignited a wildfire miles south of his patrol zone. Ethan was reassigned to assist the containment team. Days blurred together, smoke, ash, exhaustion. But on the 5th night, something happened he would never forget. He was hiking a containment line when he heard it, that deep, resonant hum. Familiar. Terrified. Through the haze, he saw movement. Huge, fast, deliberate. Gray Paw, carrying something. Ethan froze. Through the smoke, he saw her. Ember, the female he hadn't yet met, fur scorched in places, eyes wide with panic. In her arms, a small figure clung tightly. The juvenile, Willow. They were fleeing the fire. Without thinking, Ethan dropped his gear and waved toward the riverbed. This way. Water. Gray Paw's eyes locked on his. For a split second, 2 species understood each other perfectly. The family followed. Together they descended into the ravine, smoke swirling above. Ethan led them to the shallows, where the fire couldn't follow. Hours later, when the flames had moved on, he turned, and they were gone. But beside where he'd stood, something new had been left behind. A single smooth stone, streaked black with ash, placed at the water's edge. A thank you. The fire destroyed nearly 20 square miles of forest. When the smoke cleared, wildlife surveys began. Ethan volunteered for the northern range, near the canyon where he'd seen the family. For months, he found no trace. But then, one morning, by the edge of a burned glade, he noticed movement. 3 dark shapes, barely visible through the mist. Gray Paw, Ember, Willow, alive. Watching him, Ethan didn't approach. He just raised his hand, palm open, over his heart, their shared gesture. Gray Paw mirrored it. Ember followed. And the child, little Willow, mimicked them both. That was the moment Ethan knew. This wasn't an encounter. It was an alliance. Over the next 2 years, Ethan's understanding grew. He began to notice patterns not just in individual gestures, but in social behavior. The way the creatures moved in coordinated silence, how they used distance and posture to communicate. He mapped their range, a territory spanning several miles of ridge and river valley. He recorded their diet, fish, roots, berries, occasional deer carcasses. But what fascinated him most was the rituals. At dawn or dusk, they would gather in small clearings and perform rhythmic movements, swaying, tapping, humming in complex patterns. Not random, not animalistic. Structured, symbolic. He called it the chorus. In his notes, possible form of collective communication, spiritual or social bonding, parallels human song or prayer. He watched from afar, never intruding, always silent. Until one night in 1991, Graypaw did something unthinkable. He invited Ethan closer. It was midsummer, the air heavy with pine and moss. Ethan sat at the edge of a clearing, hidden behind ferns. Ahead of him, 5 massive figures swayed around a central fire. The sound was haunting, deep harmonic tones, layered and resonant, vibrating in his bones. Then, Graypaw turned, met his gaze across the firelight, and gestured for him to step forward. Ethan hesitated, then rose. As he entered the circle, the humming softened. The others, 3 adults and Ember, regarded him with wary calm. Willow peered from behind her mother's leg, eyes wide and shining. Ethan placed his hand over his chest, bowed slightly. Graypaw returned the gesture. For a moment, no one moved. Then Ember reached forward and placed something at his feet, a piece of carved wood, shaped roughly like a hand. A symbol of acceptance. Ethan swallowed hard. "Thank you," he whispered. The group resumed their low hum. And though he couldn't understand the meaning, he felt it. A unity, a peace deeper than words. That night, he didn't write any notes. He just sat by the fire long after they'd gone, listening to echoes of the chorus drifting through the trees. Ethan's connection to the family changed him. He stopped reporting to certain briefings, stopped responding to requests from regional wildlife teams. Frank Dwyer noticed. One evening, Frank visited Ethan's cabin, eyes sharp under the brim of his hat. "You've been off the grid lately," he said. "You found something out there, didn't you?" Ethan said nothing. Frank leaned forward. "You think you're the first ranger to see them?" Ethan froze. Frank sighed. "We've known about them for years. We just don't talk about it. The forest needs its mysteries. And some truths are safer unspoken." Ethan's voice was quiet. "Then why tell me?" "Because," Frank said, "once you see them, they start to see you. And that changes everything." Years passed. Ethan grew older, quieter. The world outside changed. New logging routes, new roads, new tourists. But the family remained. Every winter, he'd visit the same clearing. Graypaw would appear. Sometimes Ember and Willow joined, now taller, stronger. But that year, things were different. The air felt tense, heavy. The forest, usually alive with sound, was silent. Graypaw appeared alone. He carried something in his hand, Ethan's old silver compass, tarnished but intact. He placed it on the ground between them. Ethan knelt, touched it. "You kept it," he whispered. Graypaw made the gesture again. Tree, chest, then pointed north, toward the deeper forest. Ethan frowned. "Leave?" Graypaw nodded once. He understood then. The roads, the noise, the new construction. Humans were getting too close. It was time for them to move. Ethan's throat tightened. "Will I see you again?" Graypaw stared for a long moment, then reached forward, massive hand resting briefly on Ethan's shoulder. The touch was gentle, heavy with meaning. Then he turned and walked into the snow. Ethan never saw him again. Have you ever trusted someone so completely that their pain became your truth? That's what happened to Ethan Rowe, the forest ranger who befriended something the world said didn't exist. But this time, the forest answered back. By 2003, Ethan was no longer the eager ranger who'd first met Graypaw 17 years earlier. His beard was streaked with silver, his hands calloused from decades of solitude. He lived quietly in a ranger cabin deep within Gifford Pinchot, officially retired but unofficially still patrolling the same sacred ground. He hadn't seen Graypaw or Ember in years, not since the day they vanished into the snow. But every month, he left apples on the same moss-covered stump, as ritual demanded, and they always disappeared. Then, one July evening, while hiking near the old clearing, he saw it again, a shape, massive yet familiar, moving between the trees. Heart racing, Ethan stopped and whispered, "Graypaw." The figure stepped into the moonlight. Older now, fur streaked with gray, eyes weary but warm. It was him. For the first time in nearly a decade, they were face to face again. Ethan noticed it immediately. Deep, parallel scars running along Graypaw's ribs and back. Not claw marks. Not accidents. Bullet wounds. His breath caught. My God, what happened to you? Graypaw didn't answer in words, of course. But he didn't need to. He motioned for Ethan to follow. They moved silently through the forest until they reached a small glade near a dry creek bed. There, beneath a fallen log, Graypaw pulled out a bundle wrapped in animal hide. Inside, old, weathered newspaper clippings. Ethan's hands trembled as he unfolded them. Hunters claim $5,000 bounty for mystery creature, 1968. Man killed in mountain shootout. Unidentified animal remains confiscated by authorities. Forest Service denies existence of giant ape species. Each article was yellowed, fragile, some stained with water, or something darker. Graypaw placed his hand on his chest, then across his ribs, the scars, then pointed at the articles. Ethan whispered, "They hunted you." Graypaw nodded. That night, under a full moon, Graypaw began to show what words could not. He pointed at the sky, then to the ground, then mimed carrying something heavy. His motions grew faster, frantic. He beat his chest, made short guttural sounds that trembled with grief. Ethan slowly pieced it together. When Graypaw was young, maybe in his teens, a group of hunters had ambushed his family. 5 men, rifles. The forest filled with gunfire. Some of the creatures were killed. The rest fled. Graypaw had fallen, bleeding, and played dead among the bodies. Then men in uniforms arrived. Not police, not rangers, but government issue. They took the bodies, tagged them, loaded them into trucks, and vanished. Graypaw survived, alone, for nearly a decade before meeting Ethan. When the truth finally settled in, Ethan could barely breathe. They covered it up, he murmured. They knew. They've always known. Graypaw stared at him with deep, resigned eyes, then reached into the bundle again and produced a single torn photograph. Men in camouflage, posing beside a massive, indistinct shape. The caption at the bottom, half torn away, read, 1972, Cascade Expedition. Ethan's pulse hammered in his chest. He knew that expedition. It had been part of the Forest Service archives, but officially, it had found nothing. Now he understood why. For days after the encounter, Ethan couldn't sleep. He went through old ranger files, weathered reports, and maps. Dozens of pages were missing. Entire months of logs redacted. He drove to the ranger district office, requesting access to archived microfilm from the early 1970s. The clerk frowned. That section's restricted, she said. Restricted? Ethan repeated. It's forestry data. Not anymore, she said flatly. That night, Ethan sat alone in his cabin, staring at the photograph Graypaw had given him. Something inside him broke. He'd promised silence. But how do you stay silent when you realize the silence itself was part of a lie? He took out his recorder, pressed play, and began documenting everything. If anyone finds this, know that what I'm about to say is not fiction. There are creatures in these forests, intelligent, peaceful, older than our stories. And we hunted them, buried them, pretended they never existed. Over the next month, Ethan met with Graypaw twice more. Each time, the creature revealed fragments of memory, a pantomime of tragedy told through gesture, pain, and silence. Once, Graypaw pointed toward a distant ridge and drew 4 small circles in the dirt, each one representing a life lost. Then he drew a 5th, smaller, newer, and covered it gently with his hand. Ethan understood. Those who survived had hidden their young, buried their dead, and scattered, population collapsing. When he looked up, Graypaw was staring at him, eyes filled with something human, fear. Then Graypaw pointed toward the horizon, toward the sound of distant engines. Chainsaws, development, logging expansion. His people were being driven out again. On August 9th, Ethan found something new at the clearing, a flat rock, smooth and deliberately carved. Across its surface were deep grooves, simple shapes, a tree, a fire, a circle enclosing 2 smaller ones. Ethan took photos, sketches, notes. After hours of studying, it hit him. The circle, it wasn't just a family symbol. It was a warning. The tree meant home. The fire, destruction. The two smaller circles, children. Together, home burns. Children must flee. It wasn't art. It was prophecy. Days later, Ethan's supervisor, Frank Dwyer, stopped by the cabin. "You've been off the radar again," he said, lighting a cigarette. "Care to explain why?" Ethan hesitated. "Frank, you ever hear of the Cascade expedition?" Frank's eyes narrowed. "Why?" "I think they killed them," Ethan said softly, "and covered it up. I've seen the proof." Frank didn't move for a moment. Then, with quiet gravity, he said, "You don't want to go digging there, Ethan." "I already did." Frank sighed. "Then you'd better bury what you found, before someone else buries you." He dropped the cigarette, crushed it under his boot, and left. Ethan never saw him again. Late September, the first frost dusted the ferns silver. Ethan hiked to the clearing one last time. Graypaw was there, waiting. They stood in silence. Man and myth, two relics of an ancient secret. Ethan raised his hand, palm to chest, the shared vow. Graypaw mirrored the gesture. But this time, he added one more, hand over heart, then slowly downward, fingers curling like a closing eye. "Farewell." Ethan watched as Graypaw disappeared into the pines, the sound of his steps fading until nothing remained but wind. When he returned to his cabin that night, Ethan recorded his final message. "If this tape ever reaches you, know that truth doesn't die. It hides, waiting for someone brave enough to see it. I wasn't that man. Maybe you will be." He sealed the recording inside a tin box and buried it beneath the old apple stump. Do you believe every secret can stay buried forever? Because in 2010, the forest decided it had been silent long enough. The Cascades that winter were bitter, snow stacked shoulder high along the ridge roads, and the air cut like glass. Ethan Rowe had been retired for almost a decade now, though retired was a word that never really fit him. He still roamed the backcountry, still left apples and dried salmon on the old stump every week. And every week, they vanished. Then, one February morning, he found something he hadn't seen in years, a print, fresh, wide, 17 inches long, pressed deep into the snow. He followed the tracks for half a mile until he saw movement through the trees. Massive, deliberate. Graypaw. Ethan froze. But beside Graypaw stood two others. One was smaller, reddish-brown fur, fierce eyes. The other, taller now, but unmistakable, Willow. The child had grown. Ethan stepped forward slowly, hand over heart. The gesture still worked. Graypaw answered it. Ember mirrored him. And Willow smiled. For a few quiet minutes, the years fell away. The forest was at peace again. Then, a sharp crack echoed through the valley, gunfire. Ember screamed, a sound Ethan had never heard before, and fell to her knees. Blood stained the snow. Ethan rushed forward. "No, no, no." He tore open his pack, shaking hands pulling gauze, disinfectant, tape. Graypaw loomed protectively, growling low in his throat, torn between rage and fear. Ethan pressed the bandage against the wound. "It's a graze, through the shoulder," he said softly, his voice trembling. "You'll be okay." He looked toward the ridge. Two figures moved through the trees. Men in camouflage, rifles slung low. "Hunters," Ethan shouted. "You don't need to do this." They didn't answer. Graypaw and Ember retreated into the forest with Willow. Ethan stood his ground. That night, when he returned to his cabin, a note was nailed to his door. Scrawled in rough handwriting, "Don't go back there." No signature, just a warning. He sat by the fire for hours, the note trembling in his hand. He knew what it meant. Someone, maybe those same hunters, knew what he'd been doing all these years. Protecting them. He whispered, "Not this time." At dawn, Ethan hiked back to the clearing. The snow was trampled, marked by prints, human and otherwise. He heard voices before he saw them. 3 men, armed. The leader, a broad-shouldered man with a graying beard, was shouting orders. "Fan out." Big one went north. "We'll flush it out." Ethan stepped into view. "You're not going anywhere." The men spun around, rifles raised. "Jesus, it's just a ranger," one muttered. "I'm not just anything," Ethan said. "You fire one more shot in this forest, and I swear I'll." The leader smirked. You think you can stop us, old man? Ethan held their gaze. You don't understand what you're doing. They're not animals. The man laughed. What are they, then? Ethan took a breath. They're a family. The forest was dead quiet. Then, from the shadows, Graypaw emerged. He towered above them, chest rising and falling like a drumbeat. Behind him, Ember and Willow stood side by side, wounded but unbroken. The hunters froze. Ethan stepped between them. Look at them. Look at her, he said, pointing to Willow. She's just a child. One of the men whispered. Holy, Graypaw didn't move. He just stared at the humans with steady, unflinching eyes. For a moment, the world balanced on a knife's edge, fear against understanding. Ethan said quietly, You want your trophies? Or do you want your souls? The leader lowered his rifle. You're one man, he said. You can't protect them forever. Ethan smiled sadly. Watch me. The men backed away, muttering. Within minutes, they were gone, swallowed by the forest. Ethan turned back to Graypaw. The old creature studied him for a long moment, then placed his palm against his own chest, then against Ethan's, their vow of kinship. Ember, her wound cleaned and wrapped, leaned into Graypaw's side. Willow stood beside them, watching Ethan with wide, shimmering eyes. He knew what this meant. They had to leave. Go deeper. Hide again. He whispered. Go north. Past the ridge. There's a valley beyond the river. No roads, no trails. You'll be safe. Graypaw nodded once. Then, for the last time, he made the gesture that had defined their friendship. Tree, chest, heart. Home. Self. Forever. Ethan returned it. Home, he said softly. Yours. The family turned and disappeared into the trees, snow closing over their footprints. 2 days later, Ethan heard an engine. A truck, military green, unmarked, idled on the old access road. A man in uniform stepped out. Not one of the hunters, cleaner, colder. He looked at Ethan. You've been busy, Mr. Rowe. Ethan said nothing. The man smirked. If you care about your career, your pension, or your life, you'll stop talking about what's out there. Understood. Ethan stared at him. You can silence me, but you can't silence them. The man's smile faded. We already did once. He got back in the truck and drove away, tires spinning snow. Ethan watched until the taillights vanished, then whispered, Not this time. That night, Ethan built a fire at the edge of the clearing, their old meeting place. He laid 3 apples at its base, one for each of them. The flames flickered, painting the trees gold. He raised his recorder one last time. If anyone finds this, know this wasn't about discovery. It was about respect. The forest isn't ours to conquer, it's ours to protect. And some truths don't need to be proven. They just need to be believed. He placed the recorder beside the apples and walked away, not once looking back. By morning, the snow was smooth again, untouched, perfect, silent. Have you ever kept a promise long after the person you made it to was gone? Because for Ethan Rowe, a promise wasn't something you said. It was something you lived. The forest had changed. Logging roads cut deeper. The air smelled of diesel and pine sap. But Ethan was still there, still walking his old patrol routes with the same slow patience, boots sinking into the moss. Every Sunday, he'd leave an offering on that same old stump. 3 apples, a strip of smoked salmon, and sometimes a hand-carved wooden heart. And every Monday, they were gone. He didn't need footprints anymore. He didn't need proof. The silence itself was proof enough. One morning in spring, he found a new sign, a woven ring of fern and wildflowers, placed where his apples had been. He laughed quietly. You're still watching, he whispered. And from the tree lean, a faint, low call answered him. Deep, resonant, almost human. By late 2012, rumors had spread again. Hunters whispered about giant shadows near Lake Adams. A young journalist from the Oregon Ledger tracked Ethan down, hoping for an exclusive. Mr. Rowe, you were with the Forest Service for over 30 years, she said. You ever see anything unusual? Ethan smiled. Depends on what you call unusual. She pressed. Some say you've got photos. Proof. He chuckled. Proof isn't what matters. What does, she asked. He looked out the window toward the endless green horizon. Respect. We lost that somewhere along the way. The journalist frowned, unsatisfied. So you're saying the Bigfoot stories are real? Ethan met her gaze. I'm saying there are things in this world that survive because we don't chase them. It was dusk when Ethan heard the sound again, soft footfalls behind the cabin. He reached for his lantern, heart pounding. And there she was, Willow, no longer a child, taller now, fur darker, eyes older. For a moment, neither moved. Then she reached out, touched her chest, and pointed toward the stump. Home. Ethan smiled, tears blurring his vision. Still remember, he whispered. She stepped closer, close enough that he could see a faint scar running down her forearm, a hunter's bullet, long-healed. Without a word, she placed something in his hands, a smooth river stone, carved crudely with two interlocking handprints, one human, one not. Then she turned and vanished back into the trees. Ethan stayed there for hours, holding that stone like it was made of gold. By winter, men in dark SUVs returned, federal types, suits too clean for forest work. They asked questions, showed badges that meant nothing. Mr. Rowe, one said, "You're the only ranger from your district who's logged over 400 unsolved wildlife incidents. Care to explain that?" Ethan smiled politely. "Nature's full of mysteries." The agent leaned closer. "If we find you've been hiding something," Ethan cut him off, "then you'll finally learn what happens when you try to cage the wild." They left after an hour, clearly unsettled. That night, a storm hit the Cascades. Lightning split the sky, trees bent under the wind. Ethan stepped outside, arms open, laughing into the rain. "You hear that, Graypaw?" he shouted. "Still here. Still keeping watch." Thunder answered him. Ethan was 78 when his knees began to fail. His doctor told him to move to town, but he refused. "This forest has my bones already," he said. That autumn, he made one last climb to the ridge, slow, steady, every step deliberate. He reached the old stump, set down 3 apples and the carved heart. His breath came in foggy bursts. He looked up at the fading sun. "This is it, my friends." A shadow moved in the distance. Then another. And then 3 figures stepped from the tree-line. Graypaw, Ember, Willow. Older now, their movements slower, but their eyes still alive with quiet wisdom. Ethan smiled. "Didn't think you'd come." Graypaw raised his hand to his chest, then toward Ethan, the eternal gesture. Ethan mirrored it, hand trembling. "Home," he whispered. Willow stepped forward, placed her palm gently on his shoulder, a final goodbye. Moments later, they melted back into the mist, their silhouettes fading with the dusk. Ethan sat beside the stump, the forest glowing gold and blue around him. He closed his eyes, a peaceful smile still on his face. When forest rangers found Ethan's cabin months later, they discovered everything left untouched. Coffee cup half full, journal open on the table. On the final page, written in his neat block letters, "They lived, they learned, they forgave. The forest will keep them safe, if we let it." Beside the note lay the carved river stone, the one Willow had given him. 2 handprints, side by side. And outside the cabin, fresh footprints, massive, barefoot, leading toward the mountains. Decades later, hikers still report seeing lights moving in the Cascades. Not flashlights, lanterns. Slow, rhythmic, almost like patrols. Locals call them rose lights, the spirit of the ranger who refused to let the wild die quietly. Every now and then, an apple disappears from a stump near Mount Adams. Maybe it's the wind, maybe it's memory, or maybe it's a promise still being kept. The forest doesn't owe us answers. It owes us balance. Ethan Rowe didn't spend his life chasing monsters. He spent it proving that understanding begins where fear ends. In a world obsessed with discovery, he chose respect. And maybe that's the rarest thing of all. So if you take anything from this story, let it be this: the wild isn't something we own, it's something we belong to. Thank you for watching. If this story moved you, if it made you feel that spark of wonder, hit that like, share it with someone who still believes in the unknown, and drop a comment below. Would you protect them or expose them? And remember, some secrets aren't meant to be solved. They're meant to be honored. We'll see you in the next story.